minorly allergic to the phrase lifestyle business. I think just because of where like the general idea behind it and like what people think of as a lifestyle business, something entirely hands off that just prints them money. Fun fact, those don't exist. So
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to Responsibly Reckless, the show where we talk about how to thrive in uncertainty and live life without regret. Advice is contextual, and what works for one person may not work for you. So we'll talk to top performers and dig into why they make the decisions they do, giving you the tools you need to pick the right advice for your unique situation so that you can build your version of a successful life, not somebody else's. Today's guest is Johnathan Lyman. Johnathan is the founder of a coffee business, has a candle business, is a software developer at Heroku, blogs in his free time, and he's a father. In today's episode, we talked to Johnathan about his different businesses, his thoughts on minimizing risk and leveraging existing knowledge, his thoughts on the pros and cons of running a business versus working for someone else, common misconceptions about lifestyle businesses, how to find the right life partner and have an amazing relationship, as well as a bunch of other topics. This episode touches on a wide range of areas, so listen in, enjoy, and feel free to hop around to whichever topics pique your interest most.
Oh,
we
yeah.
just like the sugar. Let's just admit it.
Yeah, whoever came up with the marketing aspect of pumpkin spice was a genius, man. That's all I'm saying. And actually funny, like related to pumpkin spice and fall, right now I know that this weekend is actually like Halloween weekend. Yeah. So had a late night with my friends last night and just having a little bit of coffee now to help with our podcast. And related to coffee, I know that you actually have your own coffee business that you've been running, Seaplane Coffee, if I'm not mistaken.
That's correct. Yeah.
I'd love to hear a little bit about that. I know that coffee and caffeine runs the world, so it's a super interesting business to run, and I guess you can get high on your own supply, quote unquote.
You can, especially when you only charge yourself cost for such supply. Great segue, by the way. I'm impressed as a former podcast host. I liked how you connect all that together. I had a feeling the coffee was going to come up first on the topic of pumpkin spice there. I like that bridge you drew. Well done. 10 out of 10. Yeah. So in 2020, actually technically I came up with the idea originally Christmas of 2019, right before the pandemic. And I was like, yeah, it sounds like something I could probably try to do, but didn't really get off the ground until June, July 2020, in the height of the pandemic. I started a coffee business on the internet. And there's no shortage of those, let me tell you. But, I didn't really care, frankly. I honestly didn't do a whole hell of a lot of market research when I started this. I just kind of did it just because it sounded interesting. It was something, I like coffee. I like selling things on the internet, as you'll probably come to learn. I got a whole book of notes here.
Nice.
That's kind of my go-to reason for when someone asks why I started a various business. It's because I like selling stuff on the internet, right? So, and coffee felt like a relatively low startup cost idea in that, I lived in an apartment at the time, and so naturally I didn't really have space to roast myself, right? Do all the logistics myself. So I found a partner roaster here in the area that was willing to take on that burden for me, and charge me per bag essentially. And that took a huge amount of burden off getting things started off the ground, getting things started. The cost of coffee roasting equipment at scale is stupid, just utterly disgusting, right? If you're home roasting, it's not terrible. But at the scale that I felt I was going to need to offer any kind of expansion room I just wasn't willing to spend that money. So having the partner was super helpful. And, you know, the guy that runs that show there, it's quite literally two people, himself and I think one of his kids, and that's it. That's their entire company, right? Being small like that, you know, I could more or less dictate the rules of engagement. Like, you know, he tells me the price, I tell him what I want, and he tells me if that's going to be a different price. You know, that's it. You know, that's the whole story. No complicated contracts, no minimums, none of that stuff, right? And he's close enough that I can, you know, if I need something from him or if I need to give him supplies of some kind, I can just drive it up there. You know, it's probably an hour away with traffic. So that makes, you know, even easier. Like there was just no reason to not go with him at that point. I had looked at a couple other facilities and they were all more expensive and they all had really weird specific processes and, you know, the rules, that kind of stuff. And I didn't feel like that was going to be super conducive to me kind of doing this fly by night, making it up as I go along. Right. So if it's not clear, I didn't plan this too terribly long before I just sent it out on the world. Right. I picked out a bag, I made a label, picked the coffees and said, let's go, just shove it out there, you know, and see what happens. The first sales came from friends, coworkers, things like that, kind of iron out the kinks and whatnot. And, you know, some of my current and former coworkers are still customers to this day, which is wonderful. They had no obligation to continue being customers, but I appreciate that nevertheless. But one of the things I tried to do and I regret, there are two things I regret in this business thus far. The first, coming back to the packaging and the labeling and stuff, I regret not spending the extra time and effort and money to come up with a truly unique package design. You know, like you walk down the coffee aisle at your grocery store, they're all different, right? They all stand out in some way. When I started, I took the cheap route and I bought just a bunch of blank coffee bags and slapped labels on them, which is fine. That's entirely acceptable. But because I am the person that would never be happy with whatever I produced, I've changed the bag and label design 3 times now in a little over 2 years. Whereas if I had gone the more expensive route, because I would have had to spend a lot more money on a custom package, I would be less likely to change it, you know, because it would force me to be okay with it for a lot longer. The, I guess, interoperability or modularity of the packaging let me change the bag and keep the label, or change the label and keep the bag, and things go left and right and tweaking this and that. And, you know, and I've thrown away so many labels that I've, you know, swapped out for other stuff now. Like it's just been a waste. So that's, I regret that. I regret not spending what would have probably been maybe close to 10 grand and just buying all of the best packaging first and then just being done with it and not having to think about it for a long time. So I've probably spent about 10 grand on packaging to date. Anyways, so here we are. On the flip side, I don't know if like that wasn't ever something that occurred to me initially either. Like I didn't have the foresight to recognize that this would be problematic for me a year or 2 years down the road. So, you know, you can play both sides of that. And I try not to beat myself up over it. It is what it is. You know, I'm always a fan of iterating and improving as you go along and learning from that. So it's not a total waste, but it is something I think about every time I order new labels or add a new coffee to the lineup, et cetera, et cetera. My second regret is marketing a internet-centric coffee organization. It's a very fancy way of putting that, to the local market. Initially, Seaplane Coffee went by the name of Kenmore Coffee Company. I lived in Kenmore, Washington. It made a lot of sense at the time, right? I live in Kenmore. I'm going to name it after the place I live. The problem is the market doesn't look at it that way. They look at it as, it's Kenmore Coffee Company. Where are you located in Kenmore? Immediately the line they draw. And it's through no fault of their own, right? It makes sense. In hindsight, I would have never named it that if I had known that is the connection that folks were going to make. I would have come up with something a lot more neutral, kind of like I did now. Seaplane Coffee, still influenced by where it was founded. Kenmore, Washington has a locally famous seaplane, float plane, harbor, airport, seaport, whatever you want to call it, right? Does all sorts of flights all over the Pacific Northwest into Canada, stuff like that. It's pretty popular endeavor. So the concept of the seaplane as like a theme and a brand element is pretty common in the Kenmore area. So, I stuck with that instead. Probably should have gone with it in the first place. It's still, like I said, related to where it was founded, but also entirely neutral. And now the tagline is your local internet coffee roaster. Kind of trying to play on the idea that, it's the brand is not mass market by any stretch. I have no plans on it being so. I don't want to get into coffee that much for that. If somebody wants to make it mass market, they can buy it off of me and go nuts. But at the same time, it's available to anybody, right? I try to make it as neutral across the country as possible. We're not dedicated to the Pacific Northwest, like some brands are, right? Like you think of like REI is a pretty hardcore Northwest brand. Patagonia, like they have themes, like just the way they are, they channel that natural energy, if you will, from where they're located, right? I try not to do that too much beyond the basic branding and theming and whatnot. So yeah, two big regrets right off the top, the things I wish I did differently. But all in all, I don't know, it's been fun. Yeah, I've learned a lot more about coffee than I ever thought I would. I still consume as much as I did before, which is good. Didn't get any worse. I mean, arguably it got cheaper because, like I said at the top of this program, I charge myself cost, or more or less. The cost varies from time to time, and I don't want to do the math, so it's cost-ish. It's good enough.
Yeah, related to the coffee business, I think those are two great lessons right out the get-go. One thing I find is interesting is the challenge of balancing perfection with iterations over time, where you're saying you're a big fan of iterating as you go, but you kind of also wish that you were able to just redo things and had gone with the perfect packaging straight out of the boat. What I'm wondering is how do you balance the act of perfectionism with the act of just kind of going and quickly iterating? Because I feel like that can be a challenge and very contextual to the person as well as the situation.
I think for me anyways, if I was able to take thinking about how much time I've spent on iterating on the packaging, using that as an example, if I could take that time back dozens of hours, right? I would either be able to spend that on something else entirely not related to the business, more free time for whatever, right? Or channel that into a different aspect of the business. Because I don't do coffee full time. I have a day job. So, this is like a nights and weekends type of thing for me, right? So every hour is crucial, thinking about all the time that I could get back, not, spending, redesigning every label, printing it, realizing something was wrong in printing, having it all reprinted again. That happened. One of my artwork files was visually correct, both on my screen and in the proofing process. But when it got printed, there was something catastrophically incorrect about it. No way to know that was going to happen until all the labels showed up and they looked like garbage. And it took weeks to get that fixed. And, I could argue that none of that would have potentially happened if I had just, quote, done it right the first time, At the same time, I'm painfully aware that, what they say, perfect is the enemy of good. Though I would, knowing myself well enough, even if I had taken that, should have done it both right the first time route, I probably would still have things I would critique about it. Like it's that would not just magically go away if I had done it right the first time. But like I said, because it would create a much higher barrier to doing something about it, I feel like I would have been able to convince myself that this is actually okay. This is fine. Do I wish it was different in some minute way? Maybe, sure. But I feel like that's going to be a problem for me anyways, no matter what I produce. I'm always going to be thinking about the next iteration of it. So
yeah,
does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it's interesting because it's easy to have 2020 hindsight where it's like, now that I know what I know now, I wish I could just go back and do it right the first time. But you highlight a very good point, which is that there are certain issues and mistakes you can't really know until you've actually gone through it. And I think that this is a good point for our listeners to recognize, is that whatever you're trying or doing, there are certain issues that you won't foresee until you actually try to tackle the challenge that you're facing. So don't try to wait till you figured out all the variables, because you can't. Sometimes you do just need to get started. And then through hard work and experience, you'll be able to know those lessons for next time. And this is a point about why some people will start one business and then the next business they'll start a related business, and it goes a lot easier. If you were to follow this up with your next coffee business, for instance, you've already learned the lessons from this one. So anytime you can take existing experience or knowledge and apply it to something else, the better off you'll be. And I think that this is something people can try to keep in mind with businesses as well as with careers. For instance, like maybe I try to pick a tangential career. So always try to leverage the knowledge and experience that you previously had.
Yeah, I liked it. I like that. That's a very, very elegant way to put it. And yeah, if I did ever get into the coffee business in some other form, or quote, took it to the next level, whatever that is, right? Like, there are things that I would have to change, but I'm aware of all of those components at this point, right? Like, let's say theoretically, I ended up going national and was put in a chain of some kind, right? The first biggest one that comes to mind is Kroger chain of grocery stores. Kroger or King Soopers, I think, if you're in the Rockies, or Fred Meyer out west, stuff like that, right? Like, having that kind of national exposure would take everything to such an entirely new level that I would almost have to start over anyways. So knowing that, all of the trials and tribulations that I went through the first time, I'm already aware of the hurdles that are going to come up along the way. So we can skip right to the good part at the end.
And related to taking it to the next level, you bring up another good point, which is that it's important to know what level you want to be at, the type of business you want to build, and starting from the beginning, because a lot of people think in their head, oh, I need this crazy, insane business. I need to be in stores around the globe. And it's like, wait a second, let's take a step back from what your goals are. There's nothing wrong with having just a lifestyle business, or a business that I just do for fun, or a business that you just want some side income, and being able to know yourself and know what you want to achieve and then work backwards. I think too many people kind of just like hastily jump in without knowing what the end is in mind, and that can kind of bite them in the butt.
Yeah, I saw that a lot, especially when, my side hustle of the day, the flavor of the day was selling on Amazon. There were a lot of folks who were like, I hate my 9-to-5 job and I want to have a lifestyle business. Like, I small side tangent. I'm minorly allergic to the phrase lifestyle business. I think just because of where, like, the general idea behind it, and like what people think of as a lifestyle business, something entirely hands off that just prints them money. Fun fact, those don't exist. So, when that comes up, I always feel like there needs to be a bunch of asterisks add on to the end of it. Cause it's like, at some point, if you do it right and you are successful, your business will help you get the lifestyle you want. But the business itself is not a lifestyle business. It's going to take a lot of work to get to the point where you want the lifestyle that you want, right? Like, that's the part that I feel like gets left out a lot when you hear the topic come up of creating a lifestyle business. It's like, how do I want to put this? If all you want is a lifestyle business, you would have a better chance of just betting on horses or putting money into the stock market and hoping you win, right? Like, that's, if you're looking for something that's not going to require a lot of work, any regular business, arguably across most categories, it's going to require probably more work than you're anticipating. So just keep that in mind. Anyways, back on topic. What were we talking about? I can't keep open parentheses in my head like that.
No,
so
I love
whatever
it,
was on topic at the moment is completely out of my head.
No, free flowing. And just an additional point on that. Yeah. Anytime you hear the buzzwords of passive income or lifestyle business, or if the business forms a pyramid schemes, you should avoid all those. So the shortcut at the end of the day is the long route. Be consistent, do the hard work, and then eventually you'll have an easier path to financial success or passive income. But you can't do that without putting in the work.
For sure.
Back to the original question that we were talking about, or the original point was kind of knowing with the end in mind of what kind of business you want to build. Yeah. One question I'm curious is how did you decide what type of business you wanted to build, where the spectrum ranges from I'm just going to make coffee and like sell it to one person, I'm just going to do an online business, all the way to something at the national scale. And like you have a great software job, which you also really enjoy. So there's competing priorities, competing things you love to do. How did you go about deciding where this business would fit into your life and the scale you wanted to have it at?
When I quipped about, seeing a lot of folks who hated their 9-to-5 and were looking to replace it, I think for a lot of folks, that is like an actual true legitimate motivator to build a great empire, so to speak. For myself, I enjoy my 9-to-5, right? Like that's, I appreciate the stability that a 9-to-5 provides. I appreciate and enjoy the work that I do. I enjoy and appreciate the company I work for. Like I don't have any negatives in that category that would push me to want to replace it with anything. So having that, it helps me in two areas. One, it lets me kind of just do whatever I think is interesting and see if it works out, which is kind of how the coffee thing started. And, to answer your question more directly, that's more or less the perspective I took on it. That was the direction, let's start selling coffee on the internet and see what happens. Right. If it blows up, fantastic. If not, if it's just kind of a thing that exists kind of off to the side, that's fine too. I'm totally okay with that. I set the benchmark so low that, as long as a month is profitable, like to me, that's a win. That's a success right there. Like that's practically the only goal that I have is to remain profitable, So, and the second thing, having a 9-to-5 and having that stable income, it allows me to feel comfortable taking a risk and, being comfortable with the potential of failure. My bills are still going to get paid if I had to close down the coffee business tomorrow. Like I'm not concerned in the least bit about that. Do the taxes the final year and be done with it. Like that's it. I'm able to just kind of shut it off almost immediately because there's no side effects from that. So not having the financial risk while still being able to take risks, I think puts me in a unique position to kind of just do what seems interesting in the moment.
I think that there's a lot of great stuff to unpack there. One, I'd start off with risk reward, where one good point you highlighted is that it's important to have some stable source of income to balance out the risk. You want to kind of do 80-20, 80% consistency, being able to take care of your bills frees you up to focus on these passion projects that might be a bit more risky. The same can apply to investing, and not just with being able to put cash aside, but you can think much more clearly when you have the stability. If you are dependent on this coffee business, you are going to be stressed out and you're not going to be as an effective of a thinker. And then second thing is that you talked about starting this coffee business saying, hey, we're just going to see where this goes. We're just going to kind of have fun and grow it as we can. And one of the value points I see there is that by doing this, you're taking a much longer term approach where, because you're not just purely doing this for the cash, you'll be able to stick with it longer. There is value to doing things just for cash, such as a job. But again, starting with the end in mind, you're like, I'm doing this purely because I enjoy it. So that way, no matter how long something takes, you're going to stick with it. And that's why people will often say pursue an area of passion related to your business, because it will help you stick through the hard times, grow throughout the process. That being said, you do want to make sure that it's something you're willing to commit to for a long time.
Sure.
And then one other good point you brought up was you actually really enjoy your day job. You love it. And I think that that's an important thing to highlight, because a lot of people get stuck in this hustle porn, quote unquote, this entrepreneurship porn. Oh, I need to quit my job right away and start my own business. It's like, wait a second. Why do you need to do that? There's nothing wrong with loving your job. And there is a lot of value to the consistency, like you said. It feels good to be able to go to bed at night knowing I'm going to get my paycheck again in 2 weeks.
Yeah.
And a lot of people should question why they want to start their own business. And if it's to pursue a passion like you're doing, if it's to replace their income, because there are risks and rewards to each aspect. And entrepreneurship may be right for some, but people should also recognize all of the risk and inconsistency involved and think if they can handle that threshold and if it's the best way to achieve their goals. Going to the, oh no, yeah, jump in on that. It sounded like you have some.
And I was just thinking before we get too far away from that, one thing that came to my mind I wrote down here was like those who, I would argue, if you can leave your 9 to 5 and keep your bills paid, then fine, go for it, right? A lot of folks that I saw, especially during my Amazon era, who were trying to leave their 9 to 5 or were leaving their 9 to 5, maybe didn't really have a backup plan or the finances to supplement the now lost income. Some of them did. And I would argue if you have enough savings or you have enough alternative income, you have a spouse that makes plenty of money and, if you quit your job, it'd be fine, right? If you have a backstop like that, I would never argue to stay in your 9 to 5 just because, having those additional resources definitely takes a lot of the pressure off of what's going to happen when I quit my job. As long as your bills are going to still get paid, I would argue almost opposite of what I argued, 10 minutes ago, and that, go for it. If you are truly committed to making it a full-time endeavor and you have the resources to make that happen, absolutely do that. I feel like if I wanted to make the coffee business a full-time endeavor, we have the finances to make that happen. I could make that happen, but I don't want to. I could, but I don't want to, and knowing that is there just in case, again, falls back into that category of being able to offload the risk because everything is already taken care of and the coffee is more or less just for fun.
Yeah. And this is a very good point too. And the fact that it, depending on how you think of it, can contradict with the previous point. I don't think it really contradicts. I think what it highlights is that so much is contextual. Like you said, like knowing what's right for you. And it makes me think of the fact that a lot of people mistake comfort for happiness, and they can fall into the groove of, oh, I'm very content with what I'm doing, but not really thinking about how pursuing these projects while uncomfortable can lead to a lot more fulfillment and happiness. And you get a lot of your fulfillment and happiness from all these projects you're working on, as well as from family life, kids, and things like that. But I think a lot of people get stuck in the groove of, I'm in my job, I just watch the same Netflix shows on replay, and they should be able to take a step back and say, wait a second, what am I actually doing? Is this bringing me fulfillment? Or am I just avoiding pain by keeping consistency? So analyzing the goals and then making sure to know the difference between happiness and fulfillment versus the comfortableness.
And I'm thinking, for those listening who are like, but Johnathan, I really, really hate my 9 to 5 and want to get out now. I don't necessarily have all the immediate money, but I feel like I could make it work. And to that, the only thing I can really say is only that. Like that is something at the end of the day, Jake and I can sit here and tell you what we think the best ideas are. Some of it based on experience, some of it based on, being in our, comfortable positions currently. Ultimately, your risk the risk you're willing to tolerate, the highest level of stress you're willing to take on. You know your personal and financial situations the best. Like only you can really make that decision. If you feel like the best route for your success overall is to just peace out tomorrow without really having a backup plan, then fine. That's, if that's the best solution for you, then go for it. Just know that, you're taking on a bit of an extra load, and be aware what that actually means. Like that's also acceptable. There's no one size fits all answer here.
And I love that you said that, because that's one of the main points of this show that I like to highlight, is that so much of advice is contextual. I can give my opinion, you can give yours, and advice that works for us may not work for someone else. And I think that one thing that's very important that I want to try to dig into with this show is being able to examine other people's paths, their way of thinking, and then have listeners and other people really do the thinking for themselves. Mm-hmm. I know that early on in entrepreneurship and business and in life, I would look to others and say, what are they doing? What's the right answer? But since what's right for one person may not be right for the others, at the end of the day, you're going to have to do some critical thinking and think for yourself. And the more people can train themselves to make these tough decisions and be decisive in what they think is right for them, despite what other people say, the better off they'll be in life. And I think that this coffee business you're running is a great way to do that. I think that there's more than one way, but starting your own business, great way to teach you how to think with constraints in difficult situations. And this is an area that people should try to practice more, because it's such a valuable skill in life.
Agreed. I don't have anything else to add to that. I love it. It was very eloquently put.
Thank you.
Professional podcast host right there, everybody.
Well, I'm going to have to get your podcasting tips in a little bit, because you have some more experience. So I
have that bullet on here. Don't worry. We'll get there.
And before we get there, I wanted to jump into the Amazon business. I know that you mentioned the Amazon business, how you segued from Amazon to the coffee business. Mm-hmm. Before we talk about the segue part, I wanted to just hear a little bit about what this Amazon business was.
Yeah. So I think like most folks, I got started in retail arbitrage. It was neat. It was a neat idea.
And retail arbitrage, could you just tell listeners who don't know, we do have a good amount of some Amazon listeners, but there's also the non-Amazon listeners as well.
Of course. Retail arbitrage is the idea of, or the practice of, really, say you're at your local Target or other retail store of choice. It really doesn't matter. And you see a product for sale on the shelf for a price. That particular product is selling for, let's say, 2 or 3 times more on Amazon. Retail arbitrage is the concept of buying that product from that retail store or even online and selling it on Amazon for a profit. So, I mean, it could really be any particular product too. Like there's no, I think one of the biggest allures to it is that it could literally be anything. There's such a wide range of product categories that folks gravitate towards, especially at this time of year. There's a lot of toys and home goods and things like that, especially after seasons end and things go on clearance. People are swooping into the retail stores to, scoop up clearance and then, send it into Amazon's warehouses to be fulfilled by them, what we, more commonly refer to as fulfilled by Amazon or FBA. And yeah, rinse and repeat. Like that's it. That's in a nutshell, that's the entire concept. Buy low, sell high. Buy from a retail store, sell high on Amazon.
Yeah, and one funny point or one interesting point I think you bring up, buy low, sell high. You can often draw correlations between different vectors in life and business that people don't think about. Like a lot of like stocks work the same way, right? Like buy low, sell high. And people don't think about, you can deploy capital into other forms of investments, such as random toys from Target or sneakers. And being able to draw these correlations across different verticals and markets can help you think outside the box, come up with new ideas. So that's just one exercise that people can start to practice is how can I take novel ideas from one area in business and life and apply it to others? But back to the retail arbitrage business. So you were doing some retail arbitrage. I'm not sure if you were also doing some online arbitrage.
Yeah, I did both. Online arbitrage wasn't as fulfilling, I think, just because it was so hands off and not really engaging. I think at the time, and I'm sure a lot of folks would agree with me on this, those that do retail arbitrage, part of it is the thrill of the hunt, being able to go find those deals and scooping them up before some mythical other person does. I don't suspect it is as a big of a thing over here in this part of the country because, from the time that I did it, I found a lot of the best flippable deals were in the Midwest and in the Southeast. I think more naturally because of just how the various chains and other stores priced their items. They tend to go on clearance. I'm trying to think how I want to describe this succinctly with also not insulting folks at the same time. The lower cost of living areas tended to see products go on clearance first, which means up here in the Pacific Northwest, I don't know if you know, but Seattle is a high cost of living area.
Oh yeah. We got a couple of tech
top 5
there.
So the things that would go on clearance at Walmart in, Biloxi, Mississippi, is that in Mississippi? I think I might have, I hope so. Otherwise I just made that up. Or Kansas City, right? Like they would never go on clearance over here. Like they would just sell out at regular price. There would be no need for it to go on clearance. So that, it took a little bit of the fun out of it in that, the hunts were automatically a bit more difficult. But at the same time, it didn't ever feel like there was a large retail arbitrage following, if you will, up here in the Pacific Northwest. So I also kind of feel like there are enough people up here that make enough money that they don't feel like it's necessary.
Yeah.
And I think that's where a lot of folks' motivation to getting into this comes from is that, their job isn't fulfilling or their job doesn't pay enough and they need to supplement their income. Right. So I did it for the hell of it. And maybe that's insulting to folks who are doing it to actually try and make a living, but I was doing it just for kicks. Which also helped me realize that I don't actually like it as much as I thought I would. I did it for probably 6 months and it wasn't for me. So I switched to wholesale, having a wholesale Amazon business, wholesale meaning buying products at wholesale prices from distributors or vendors directly. I would argue the proper way. I have some now, interesting, unique perspectives on the concept of retail arbitrage. Maybe we'll get into later, but being a business making, quote, legitimate business purchases from other businesses being authorized to sell their products. I use the word authorized. We'll get to that in a second as well, on Amazon for a profit, kind of like a regular retail establishment would, right? Like buying low, selling high, but now I'm doing it the quote legitimate way. And I've dropped a few particular keywords in there. I promise we will get to that, but that is how the Amazon business morphed. I did wholesale for about a year or so. That's how I met mutual friend Dylan Carter, and ultimately how Dylan and I ended up doing the Welcome to Growth podcast. For those that don't know who Dylan is the mastermind, one of the masterminds behind the Aura repricing tool for Amazon sellers. Company is called Vendrive. I'll toss a link for show notes there.
Yeah, and quick plug, Dylan, you're going to be able to, if you want to find out more about him, you'll be able to listen to him in one of the first few episodes. So feel free to check that out. We're tying everything together, so I love it.
We'll throw that link in the show notes too. So that's the short version of it. I transitioned from the Amazon business to doing coffee because the coffee was more mentally fulfilling, I suppose, is probably the best way to put it. I enjoyed selling other people's products for money. Like I said, I love selling stuff on the internet, right? Where it comes from doesn't necessarily matter, but it wasn't mine. And there was a lot of overhead to making that happen. And I felt like if I'm going to have this time overhead, mostly time and mental effort. If I'm going to have that overhead, I'd rather just sell my own stuff, and ergo see coffee conversation from earlier.
No, I love it, man. And one point I want to kind of dig into, you mentioned an interesting point about how a lot of people will jump into retail arbitrage for the cash aspect, and a lot of people in the Seattle area are maybe making more money. And because of that, they don't necessarily feel the need to jump into retail arbitrage. Not that everyone who jumps into retail arbitrage does it strictly for cash. But on that point, it's interesting to think about how the amount of cash we make can affect our priorities and what we do. If you're making $0 and you need food, you're going to do about anything. If you're making $1 million a year, you're going to be a lot more particular about what activities you partake in for cash. I'm curious your thoughts on how the amount of money you make can affect your priorities and decision making. And then also maybe how it might have played out in your life, if any examples come to mind.
Yeah, the amount of money you're making, the amount of money you have at your disposal to spend on your endeavor, I think absolutely affects both what you're going to do and how quickly you're going to jump into it. I wouldn't argue that the amount of money you have would determine your success, because I could easily argue that there are things you can do that don't cost a lot to start, and you can be incredibly successful with. My first retail arbitrage shipment was like 5 items after Christmas. Like it was, what was it? Oh my God. It was Christmas scented Airwick refills. So random.
I love the random products.
They were so heavily discounted at Target. It was probably like the week after Christmas, like December 29th or something like that. Right. And, the numbers worked essentially. What they were going for on Amazon, people were trying to buy them because they enjoyed them so much, but they weren't able to find them. So there's a little kind of mini opportunity there. So I scooped up all that Target had, which admittedly was only 5, but I think that kind of proves the point that there was only 5 left, right? So that was my first retail arbitrage shipment, and I think I spent like $8 on them total, and that's how the whole thing got started. I know a lot of folks who get started on Amazon take the book route, selling used books on Amazon, because also doesn't generally require a lot of capital. That's fine. I like the used book flipping market. I think it's an interesting and unique kind of subgenre of online sales and e-commerce, and it's, how do I want to put it? It's much less offensive to me than retail arbitrage is today. And maybe offensive is probably a little overkill. Like I said earlier, I have mixed feelings about the concept of retail arbitrage now, just because having been in it, I've seen behind the curtain enough to shy away from recommending it as a place to start when starting an Amazon business now. Like, it is a thing you can do, sure, and it's not a difficult thing to do, sure, but it is also legally questionable. And some would argue, no, it's totally fine. First sale doctrine. I would say there's asterisks to that. We can go down that route maybe some other time. If I went down that route, we'd take the next hour and 10 minutes to talk about it. But all of the asterisks and gray areas that come with that were how I ended up, and I'll put a link for this in show notes too, for the retail arbitrageurs who are interested. I came up with a little mini search engine on one of my sites, sellerjournal.com, called Greenlight. That is essentially, it's a database of brands that folks, it's all user contributed, the initial grouping of brands of stuff that I scraped from the internet, and various levels of probably accuracy. But as it evolved, everything that was added thereafter was all user contributed. These are all folks that have reported having issues selling those brands on Amazon. Either they received, intellectual property complaints from Amazon directly because of trademark issues, or they got a cease and desist letter from some random law firm, stuff like that. So that's where I say it is more of a gray area than it seems. And there is a lot more risk than it seems, because things like branding and trademarks and stuff like that, like that's really important to a lot of companies. And because those hurdles can be high and potentially expensive, it's more risk than I would be willing to take, knowing what I know now, right? But yeah, no, the book folks, I think that's a special talent. I think finding, I tried the book thing for a bit too, and again, like everything else over here, there's the book market up here. I only met one guy who lived about an hour south, who was really good at the book flipping, but he had to make it a full-time effort in order to get good at it. Like, and it's, if you're not interested in making it a full-time endeavor, I don't know. I don't really know what to say to that, besides it is, you can be really successful at it, but books it's a lot of work, both physically and kind of administratively, because there are so many of them out there, like literally hundreds of millions of unique titles, right? How do you know what's good? Are you comfortable with sending it to Amazon and having it sit for 9 months before somebody buys it? Like, do the numbers make sense for you for that? Like there are extra steps, lots of extra steps involved. So I wouldn't turn anyone away from books, but I don't know. If somebody came to me, I'll try and tidy this up a little bit here. If somebody came to me and asked, what type of Amazon business would you start today? I think I would start with wholesale, because selling an established brand is a lot easier than coming up with your own. Case in point, coffee that we discussed earlier. But once you've kind of built up both the mental capacity and the understanding and potentially additional capital, start selling your own brands at that point. Like, use the wholesale as a jumping point, a jump off point, but don't do it forever. Like, you will find selling your own unique products under your own unique brand to be the most fulfilling. It's also the most difficult. So that's my step 2.
And additionally on that, it goes back to our previous point about risk reward, balancing out consistency with risk. You have the day job to balance out the business, and then you have the more consistent cash from wholesale to balance out the private label or your own brand. Brand.
It's almost like there's a theme to all of this. Are you noticing something here?
Connecting the dots a bit.
Yeah. It's almost like I'm doing this on purpose.
It's funny. So with selling the books, the way I found out about selling books on Amazon is I was actually at a party with a friend, and it was like a themed party. Everyone brings books. You kind of put it down in a pile. You bring 3 books. Maybe you take 2 books home to keep. So I was like, oh, cool. Like a networking party event. We all get to bring books with us home, get some new books. I turn from a conversation I'm having, and I see my buddy scanning all the books on the tables. And I'm like, what are you doing? He's like, I'm trying to see which of these are the most profitable. And that's how I found out about selling the books on Amazon.
I did that to my mom's bookcase when I was selling books on Amazon. Like, I was like, can I go through your books? She's like, why? And it's like, I want to sell some of them on Amazon. I'll buy them off of you, I promise. I quite literally just took some of her random books that she didn't read. Which is, I think that's how a lot of the booksellers start. They look at their own collection. They look at, collections close to them. And, I remember very, very specifically one morning going to the local thrift shop. It was just a couple blocks from where we lived at the time. And I was the only one there because it was like 9:30 in the morning or whatever. And I'm just standing over in the corner in the books, going through the books like fucking weirdo. Oh man, those were the days. Sometimes I think about what it would take to get back into it. But then I'm like, I got too much other shit going on. We talked about coffee. I didn't even tell you that I also make candles and collect coins. So we didn't even get to those other bullet points yet. Like we're, almost an hour into this quality program. But yeah, it's we can talk about the candles and coins if you want, or not. We can just let that hang and let the allure, mystify the listener, I suppose.
So I want to jump into those, but there's a few topics I want to jump into even more. So selfishly, I'm going to save those for either later this podcast or for round 2. Okay. So what I want to say is with all these things going on, right? You've got the candles, you've got coin collecting, you've got your day job and your business. That's a lot of different priorities going on. I'm wondering how you personally decide what to prioritize and how you think about that. Because I think that that's a challenge for a lot of people today and in our society today, especially. People are very multi-priority. Can often be scatterbrained because we have so much coming at us at once. So being able to effectively prioritize, deciding how to allocate time, it's a challenge for all of us. And I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, well, I'll be the first to admit I'm not the best at balancing all of that. The coin collecting is more so just for me to build a collection, but it does still actually take time and money. But balancing work and a family and free time and coffee and candles and errands and I could keep going, right? It's a lot. I'm not gonna lie. It takes a lot of effort to prevent myself from forgetting about one of or more of those things. And I will unfortunately admit that for a decent part of this year, the coffee business kind of sat on cruise control. Like its form. It existed and it continued to operate, but I wasn't doing anything with it. I wasn't coming up with new products. I wasn't building any marketing campaigns. I wasn't doing any of that, right? Like money was coming in, money was going out, and it's kind of just, like I said, cruise control. Candle business is seasonal, so that one's easy. Most folks don't buy candles in the summertime. Fine. I don't have to really think about it, right? But at the same time, I also have in my head that, family comes first, self-care comes first or second, like I have to be okay with saying, I'm only going to get to this today and I will do the other thing next week or whatever. Like if that's going to cause a problem for that other thing, I have overcommitted myself. That's usually the red flag for me, right? To give you a prime example right now, I'm working on a large candle order for a couple of folks for the holidays. Had to put the coffee thing, an active project on the back burner because I did not have enough free time in the day to make sure I'm tending to my needs with my family, tending to my own needs, and doing all the business stuff at once, right? I had to pick. So as far as how I ensure everything actually gets done, I don't know if I do, to be honest with you. I think because, like I had mentioned earlier, because these are things that I do for fun, do for kicks, the money is just a nice bonus. I don't feel the pressure to make sure I'm constantly growing all of these business hobbies. Does that make sense? Like, I think I might be a bit atypical in that regard. I think if it was something I was doing full time, I probably would not have a multifaceted business lifestyle. Look at that. That's a buzzword. I'll write that one down, everybody. But seriously, like, I don't think I would have those other endeavors because business one is now my full-time thing, Does that make sense?
Yeah, and what I'm unpacking here is that it's important
Jake likes to unpack.
I do.
Sorry.
I like to unpack. I like to pack. Uh, moved 26 times, so I have some experience packing.
I recognize that. I've moved 11 times in 12 years.
Oh,
So
damn. We'll have to dig into that as well. So adding that to the list. What I was going to say
this is
though,
going
oh
to be a
yeah.
long show.
So yeah, so it seems like the way you're deciding is what to prioritize is based on interest and passion versus cash specifically.
Yep.
So your deciding factors are less of the economic perspective, where
Correct.
someone who might need to pay the bills, that would be their deciding factor.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's a very succinct way of describing or reiterating my my rambling there.
No, it's great. And for the candles versus the coffee business, I was going to ask how you decided specifically which to prioritize for those two. Was
Yeah.
it because of strictly passion? Because candles, you had a very clear order in front of you versus coffee, it was a little bit less uncertain the next steps to take. I'm wondering this one specific example, how you decided, let me prioritize these upcoming candle orders versus any coffee expansion or things like that.
Yeah, so I think it would help a little if I described the coffee project I had kind of put on the back burner. So one of the things that when I had started the coffee business, I wanted to do, based on a lot of feedback I got, was offer a way to sample the product without committing to full bags, right? Because bespoke, fresh roasted coffee, blah blah blah, trademark, um, is a bit more expensive than what you buy in the retail store, just naturally, because it's there's more overhead to it. What you buy in the store is all done in massive bulk quantities, right? So it's the economics of scale are on the side of the manufacturers and retailers there. You don't quite have that when you're roasting to order, or as close as roasting to order as you can feasibly do. So when the prices are higher, folks aren't quite as interested in immediately committing to a full-size purchase. They would like to sample, see what they would actually, be most interested in before committing. So I had I had like a sample pack of 3, was it 5? And no, it was 3. I had this, I couldn't remember. I was having this conversation with my wife last night and I couldn't remember then. And it took me a while to figure it out. I had a 3 pack and a 6-pack sample, 2-ounce bags each. You can pick either all just 3 blends or the 3 at the time single origin coffees, or you can get all 6 and go nuts, right? Had that running for a while. Supply constraints made that difficult to continue. Getting the sample bags, plot twist, after the pandemic started, they became difficult to find. Super fun fact. It's an incredibly fun fact to everybody, I'm sure. Tiny coffee bags are difficult to acquire regularly. Who knew? So that became a hurdle for me. And then the constant packaging redesign influenced whether or not that offering would continue in general. So that whole concept got shelved for a while. But I wanted to bring it back for the holidays, because last Christmas and the Christmas before that, Christmas 2020, Christmas 2021, folks liked giving those as gifts. It was, get a sample pack for the coffee lover in your family, like that whole concept, right? So people would buy 3, 4, 5, 6 at a time and give them out, and neat, because it's free promotion, right? Inside there was marketing material, 25% off your full size bag of your choice. Buy whichever one of these you like, go nuts. So that was super helpful in that regard. So I wanted to bring it back for the holidays, but I wanted to do it maybe a little bit more right.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to say I want to do it right this time. I wanted to get closer to doing it right.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I meant the packaging was a little bit more interesting, and these samples were a little bit more fulfilling, I guess, if you want to put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
And by that, I mean going from 2 ounce to 4 ounce. One of the bits of feedback that I got was that the 2 ounce, one, The 2-ounce bag didn't have a valve, which if you've never looked at a coffee bag up close before, they all have little one-way air valves in them that after the beans are roasted, they off-gas pretty substantially, mostly carbon dioxide. You don't want them to sit in their own stew, so to speak. So the carbon dioxide gets expelled out of the bag. Regular air does not come into the bag to make the beans stale. It's great. It's mechanical genius. The 2-ounce bags I had didn't have those valves, so they would puff up and look funny. So pairing that with wanting to offer a little bit more, I found 4-ounce bags that had valves, matched the current bag style. Great. Everything was falling into place. The box that they came in, I went through all of the trouble of designing, essentially creating a custom box, printing on the outside, writing of my choice, etc. I got real close to the end. I was so close. The last hurdle was how I wanted to offer these samples. What I really wanted to do was allow folks to pick any 3 of their choice. Doesn't matter. 2 problems with that, which I'm sure there's an answer, and you'll understand why I haven't found out an answer here at the end of this story. But the 2 problems were, one, I use Shopify, which powers seaplanecoffee.com, to also track my supply inventory. So I have a bunch of draft products in there that represent all of my supplies. So there's a small Shopify app. I will, if I remember, I'll put a link in the show notes for that. Actually, I'm going to write that down now before I forget. That when a product is purchased, all of the relevant supplies are updated. Helps me keep track because all of my supplies are with the roaster. I don't see any of that stuff. So day to day, I have no idea what they've got unless I'm keeping track myself. So by wanting to allow someone to pick any 3 of their choice, I have to still be able to keep track of my supplies. Fine. The second problem with that was that there's no easy way for Shopify to do that out of the box, to, let somebody pick any combination of 3, because Shopify has what are called variants of products. You pick a product and, like, let's say small, medium, large, extra large. Those sizes, those are all variants of a product, right? They have a ceiling on how many variants you're allowed. And because I had 8 options to choose from, 8 times 8 times 8 variants. Someone can do the math and say that's a lot of variants, right? So that, now all of a sudden I have to come up with a bespoke or custom system on the back end to kind of help facilitate this. So, in the whole concept of perfect is the enemy of good, the perfect solution in my head was to have the full bespoke, pick any 3 and everyth's great. But my wife's like, why not just do what you did before and just have predefined categories? And it's like, well, I don't want, you know what I mean? Like, I'm back to that, eternal struggle. Meanwhile, over in Candle Land, I get a couple emails from a couple of real estate agents. They want to give candles as gifts and stuff like that. And they want to, do large orders, so I use that as an easy excuse to just shift my focus entirely and go focus on the candle thing for a while. It's not, it's not a great ending to the story, unfortunately. And at some point I do know I need to go back to finishing up the sample project because I need to get that out. I have all of the supplies. Everything's in my garage ready to go. I have all the boxes. I've got all the bags. I've got all the labels. I've paid for all of that stuff. None of that cost has been recuperated in form of sales yet. So something needs to happen with that. And once I've got the candle thing done, I basically have to force myself to go back to that because I can't leave that thread undone or it'll just never get done. Because once the holidays are over, I'm going to be even less motivated to do anything about it.
And you do end with a good point, though, which you highlight the fact that the candle opportunity was very clearly defined. Next action steps were very straightforward.
Yeah.
Versus with coffee, there was a bit more ambiguity deciding what to do, which leads to more friction. And it brings up the point that anytime you can make something more clearly defined and easier to act on, you're going to be more likely to act on it. And people who have these big tasks or challenges in front of them, it can be daunting. You get stuck in your head. You're thinking, oh, I don't even know what to do. Focus on breaking down the tasks. Try to outline things as much as possible. Make them small, actionable steps versus big, challenging, I guess, vague, nebulous things. And that can help you act on opportunities. And additionally, that when presented with two opportunities, it's a lot easier to execute on the more straightforward one. So people can have that in mind when they're deciding what are two things that they should potentially act on. One thing I'd like to hop to now, you mentioned how you were thinking through all these different coffee combinations and your wife was like, hey, just do what you did last time. On the note of wife, I'd love to hear about relationships now, kind of jumping over into relationships, kids, things like that. How did you actually meet your current wife?
She's so supportive of my endeavors. The only rule is that it can't affect our finances. We can't go broke because of anything that I do. That's basically it. You know, as long as the savings account doesn't go down, our investments don't go down because of what I'm doing, then go nuts, more or less. She didn't actually say that. I'm paraphrasing and interpreting her words and actions.
It was more how she said versus what she said.
Right. It's the fact that she hasn't said no. So that's how I'm interpreting that. Oh. But yeah, no, we met, we went on our first date, New Year's Day, 2017. We met on eHarmony. The concept of internet dating is very real. I was not foreign to internet dating at the time. I had actually met my first wife on eHarmony, ironically, back in 2011. Long story short, obviously it didn't work out. We were not compatible people in the slightest. Thanks, eHarmony. I look back on that though, and I think I joke that it's eHarmony's fault, but looking back on, you know, what my profile was at the time, I think I'd kind of opened myself up inadvertently to that kind of individual. And she's not a bad person. I sincerely doubt she'll ever hear this. But for the sake of not being a garbage human, she was not a terrible person. But her personality and lifestyle needs and wants were not compatible with me at all. And it took me much too long to see that, unfortunately.
And related to that, sorry to cut you off. I think that you bring up a good point I'd like to just quickly dig into, where two people can both be really great people and just not live compatible lifestyles. And I'd love to hear, if you don't mind, some examples of maybe incompatibilities. I know for me, I'm trying to learn from other people's experiences, and it helps to learn like things that went well, maybe lessons that were taken away to go into the next relationship, that kind of thing.
Yeah, her lifestyle centered a lot around social circles, and I don't want to sound terrible when I say this or make it sound negative, but she got a lot of enjoyment out of things like shopping and you know, updating her look and always, you know, like refreshing her style and things like that, right? Like some people are all their style is constantly changing, right? Because they're always on the bleeding edge of whatever fashion, this, that, and the other thing. And that was like a big deal for her. Whereas myself, you know, the most fashion I have is right now jeans and a flannel, right? Like this, you know, I've had this flannel for a few years now. Like I don't really refresh my wardrobe that often. I'll add to it, but it's usually in the same style as what I've already got, right? So there was always a lot of conflict in that, you know, I liked to budget. I liked to have savings. I liked to have, you know, to use the analogy, I liked to have all of the ducks in a row before we go off and do some other thing, right? Like if there's extra money in the budget this month to do whatever, go nuts. I frankly do not care. But if we have to sacrifice something in the budget, especially something that's required, or we have to take on additional debt to do something passive or fleeting, like going on a shopping spree, not going to be a fan of that, right? So that was constantly a point of contention. And at the time, I was not a very, I was pretty passive about standing my ground with stuff like that. Like I didn't have, trying to think of how I want to describe this. I didn't have the best self-esteem. And so I kind of just felt lucky that there was somebody that was willing to be with me. So I kind of just, like, I let a lot of things go because of that, right? My standards, I pushed them down so I could maintain this thing that I felt like, it took so incredibly long to get, and I'm at risk of losing because I'm not worthy, kind of, you know what I mean? So because I let a lot of that stuff slide and I didn't really stand my ground or, actually take a position or stance on any of this stuff, she more or less ended up basically running the show when it came to our finances, and she's not great at managing finances. And, once you've piled up enough years of that, which admittedly, we were only married for a little under 3 years before the divorce was finalized. Like, that's still a lot of time to do a lot of damage, and it took me years to get out of that hole. So yeah, it was a lot of little things like that. It was the low self-esteem. It was the incompatible personalities. It was the incompatible lifestyles. Like, we didn't really have much of an interest in each other's interests. Like, I don't expect my wife to take an active interest in all of my hobbies and businesses. What I do expect is at least some baseline of support if I need her for something. Like, the minimum from her that satisfies what I need is, offering advice if I ask for it. But like, if I don't ask for it, she doesn't offer it up. Like, she doesn't feel like it's necessary. We have an appropriate dynamic in that regard. And like, that's arguably not, that's a pretty low bar, frankly. Right. But in my previous marriage, we didn't even have that. Right. Like, my wife understands that sometimes I like to play video games. Totally all right with that. Obviously within reason and within certain boundaries. Like, you also have a daughter, so keep that in mind. You know what I mean? But like, it's, looking back on it, I rarely felt like I could just do random shit that I wanted to do. I found myself after we split, I found myself doing all of the random shit that I found interesting and probably being the happiest that I had been in a long time, just sitting there as a bachelor, just fucking playing video games all Saturday. You know what I mean? Just because like I never really got an opportunity to do that. It was just like that pent up demand. You know what I mean? So I learned a lot about myself after that relationship and what I actually needed out of a relationship. I had taken, not really taken a course, but I guess it was more of a book with maybe some videos spread out here and there about how to manage divorce from a guy's perspective. Like what should be the most important to you as a guy. I definitely don't remember the name of it, so it's probably not going to be in show notes. But what it really taught me was, it's, if you find yourself not focusing on yourself ever, like you will lose yourself, as Eminem once said. And after the divorce, it gave me a lot of time to reflect on all of the things that used to make me that I had sidelined that really actually weren't bad after all. I just came to believe that they were, right. It took, what was it? I think I spent 8 months, 10 months, give or take, living alone, living the bachelor lifestyle. I had, at the time, we were living in California. My ex-wife more or less made us move to California. See earlier conversation about just letting her run the show. And since there was nothing left for me in California, I came back to Washington. So I spent a whole year and a half there. I only miss the weather. I miss nothing else about that state. And it really let me get a fresh start. I started over. I had no furniture. I sold everything that wouldn't fit in the trunk of my Honda Accord before I moved back up here. And I drove back up with the cats. My mom came down to keep me company, essentially, on the 2-3-ish day drive. And yeah, got to start fresh, new apartment, all new furniture. I went to a furniture store and bought a bunch of stuff. And yeah, I felt like an entirely new person, even though I was mostly the same as I was before. I was just able to actually act on and, get to be the true version of myself. So that's why I say when I looked back at my previous eHarmony profile, it was not what I had described in there. I don't know how I ended up in that space, but it was not who I actually was. Like what I was looking for, how I described myself, it was not actually me. And once I basically had to create an entirely new profile because eHarmony had me pegged as some weirdo. So once I created the whole thing new, and I promise I'll stop talking and let you get in here.
No, this is great.
Once I created the whole profile new, actually reflecting me, like my interests and my hobbies and like who I actually was on the inside, whole world opened up again, so to speak, as far as like, potential matches, as they say, right? And couple months after that, my now wife and I matched. Spoiler, that's the end of the story there. And yeah, we had our first date on New Year's Day at a coffee shop that no longer exists, RIP. She was real creative with that. She was fielding her first dates at a coffee shop like down the street from where she lived, but she was not revealing where she lived yet. It was super resourceful, right? Props to her for that. But yeah, no, I won out. Apparently, I was neat enough to stick around with. So, and the rest is history. We got married September 2019, right before the pandemic, which is fantastic. The pandemic's not fantastic. Our timing was. And yeah, now we have a 8.5-month-old daughter. I could go on about the whole kid concept as just a total side tangent, but I will stop for a moment, let you get in there before I continue.
You're good, Ben. Yeah, we'll definitely hop into kids later. I just want to reiterate one point you made, which is that it can get very easy to be stuck in a scarcity mindset of, with your first partner, for instance, oh, I'm just lucky enough to be with this person. I can't vocalize who I am. I can't express my needs and desires. I should just be happy to be with them. Versus the abundance mindset of, I can completely be my authentic self and I trust that there are right partners out there for me. And then when you get stuck in that situation, it feels like the relationship is a burden. You have to push through it and you can lose yourself. I know for me, I've had that experience in a past relationship or two way long ago. And it's important to be able to know that you can be your authentic self. And there are relationships that can reinforce who you are and the person you want to be versus ones that can contradict that. So I'm very happy that you were able to spot that and push through that, and just highlighting that for other people. Whatever relationships you're in, make sure you live compatible lifestyles with that person. You're going to be with them for a lot longer than you think you will. Life is a lot longer than it can feel. And do you want this person who makes your life easier and makes you more of the version you are? Or do you want to feel like you're fighting an uphill battle all the time? So just wanted to reiterate that.
And yeah, like I said, in hindsight, everything was an uphill battle, whether it was finances or just getting along, interests. Like, well, the red flags were there from the start, but I chose to ignore them. And that was, as they say, I made that bed. And so then I slept in it. And I paid that price for a long time. And I know it's it's easy. It's way too easy to ignore the red flags. Believe me. Oh boy. But I think I was just desperate for somebody. You know what I mean? Like I was willing to compromise on way too much just to try and fill a hole that I thought I had to fill, which in hindsight, I didn't actually have to fill it. Like I said, I was, the happiest post-divorce that I had been in a long time, just existing and doing my own shit on my own schedule,
And on that point, I think it's important for people to remember that you can be a lot happier on your own than being with the wrong person. Too many of us get stuck in loneliness and we feel like I need someone. It's like, no. Find yourself first, be happy with yourself. And then that way you are choosing to be with someone because they make your life better, not because they fill this void you have because you're lonely.
Agreed.
And one thing I want to touch on before we get to kids is on your current relationship. It sounds like things are going very well, very excited for you. What are some thoughts you have on things that are particularly enhancing your relationship? Maybe things that are making it better, things that you avoid doing, which also help the relationship, just general relationship advice based on your experience.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that helped me in this current relationship is taking the time to, I might actually break this into two parts, and they're both kind of emotions related. Part one would be taking the time to understand, and I don't want to call them weaknesses, but the emotional parts of an individual where they are their weakest points, like just like metaphorically speaking, like think of it as a suit of armor, right? Like there are going to be weak spots in that. Think about what those look like for that individual, and how you can like understand what happens. Like what does it look like if you've accidentally poked that, right? Like to give you an example, the dynamic between my wife and I'm a meticulous preparer, like familial preparer, if you will. It took me quite a while to be okay with having kids because I didn't feel like I was prepared. Not necessarily mentally, but like physically prepared, financially prepared. Like the resources were not in place. Like if you imagine like a hunter gatherer, but in like a socio-economical sense, right? Like I didn't feel like I had gathered enough of the socio-economical berries or whatever, right? To be ready to start a family. So, when it came to conversations like that with my wife, she's a very, not outwardly emotional person, but, it is obvious when you've hit the certain spot where the inward emotional processing has begun, right? It's obvious when she's in that state, right? So being aware of those kinds of different, I guess, states of mind is probably another way to put it, right? If you're talking more than just emotions, being aware of what those look like and how the other person both handles those and like what kind of modes do they go into once they've crossed those thresholds, right? Like I can tell if I've pushed too far into a heavy topic, but only through understanding how she processes heavy topics, right? I had to do a lot of background work to be able to, not just be a total dick when it's like, why aren't you talking to me about this? Like it's, if you know what to look for, if you notice the signs, you can catch it early, So that, and there was a second part to it that I really don't remember. There probably wasn't actually a second part. I might have thought there was a second part, but I guess, on the same topic of emotions, like, knowing how she expresses her various emotions, knowing, the age old, being able to tell when your partner's upset, right? You say, is there something bothering you? And they say, no, I'm fine. Yeah, bullshit. Right. But like beyond that joke, like there's actually some truth to that, like knowing like what that, like through some trial and error and through some actual attempt at understanding, I can tell when that I'm fine is actually I'm fine, and that I'm fine is not I'm fine. You know what I mean? Like being able to piece together the context and all the clues that led up to that moment, and understanding how they handle all of those sorts of things, and like was I a dick earlier, or like did I were there things that were involved earlier that led up to this, that you know what I mean? Like being able to put together all of those clues, I feel like helps a lot. So I'm not left guessing if like, what did I do? Like I should be able to figure out what I did on my own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think one point you're making is that it's very important to take the time and energy to really understand your partner, their vulnerabilities, what makes them them, their quote unquote nervous tics when you may have pushed them a little too far. And the more you get to know them, the more you're able to work with their ebbs and flows. You can make them happy. You can know when something you said may have made them a little sad, and just really being invested in the relationship, I guess, is a good way to put it. So it sounds like that's one thing that you're doing, which is really helping the relationship, investing the time and energy, getting to know your partner very well. And this is also something that comes a lot more naturally when you're with a partner who you're very compatible with, versus one who you may have conflict with, and you might subconsciously be resistant to digging deep into who they are.
Or you might be more willing to pick a fight because fuck it, right?
Throw the boxing gloves on.
Exactly. Yeah. And it, and along that same line, that's helped us figure out both like what we are individually good at in this relationship. We spend the time to figure out like what our love languages are, and our what is that, the Myers-Briggs,
yeah.
Myers-Briggs, there we go. Sorry Myers, I didn't put you first. I regret the error. We both took those tests, and we got to see what what those meant and how they are compatible and incompatible with each other, right? So like, sure, that's just all stuff on paper, and to an extent it doesn't always reflect 100% about you as the individual, but gives you an idea where to start, right? And I think a lot of that helped. And honestly, that was all her doing. Like I hadn't thought of any of this stuff, when we first started dating. Like it didn't ever occur to me that maybe this stuff is important. Turns out it kind of is, and through that we were able to establish like, what we look for from each other as far as, affection and, conveyance of how we're feeling, both about ourselves and about the other person, things like that. Right. And it allows us to communicate without having to necessarily figure out how to find all of the best words all the time for communicating. I'm not the best verbal communicator. See all of the rambling we've done this afternoon, but I can, for example, put it down in writing pretty well. So one of the things that we did was, when we first started dating, super cheesy, but I love it. We had a journal that we passed back and forth.
Aww.
And used that. I know, right? I'm telling you, it's just gushing with cheese, right? But it was perfect for us because it allowed us to, bypass our communication weaknesses and be able to put things down in writing. Like myself, just being able to communicate in writing better than verbally. And for her, not having to be basically put on the spot and have to express all of those sensitive things there in the moment. It gave her an opportunity to think and reflect and really, figure out how she best wanted to express what was really on her mind. So, little things like that, you might be surprised at how well they actually end up working out. And, today we don't really journal. I think it's been a few years since we've done that. But when we did that regularly, it helped a lot. It helped tear down a lot of barriers, a lot of, various levels of, discomfort and foreign, this is all new, especially for me who came out of a train wreck. I was a little hesitant, right? And it helped me create a healthy, it helped me reestablish what a healthy relationship looks like without having to, dive in head first. It let me control a lot of the situation in a way that it was beneficial for me, beneficial for her. And it helped her, figure out what was most important to her in the relationship and communicate that at the same time. So we had a few conversations here and there that were heavy, and they weren't nearly as fruitful as the follow-up conversations that happen in writing. We would start something in person and then you'd go back, go to our separate corners. And then, the follow-up in writing was, always a really succinct and, detailed at the same time kind of closure for that conversation. There was never anything left hanging because we were able to utilize our strengths in that regard. So now we have a general idea of the way we are. I won't say it's perfect at all. I definitely miss the cues from time to time. And I still feel bad for it, but I can more effectively pick up what she's putting down. He had another metaphor, and yeah, we're stronger for it.
Yeah. And 2 points on that. One, you talked about the journaling, the Myers-Briggs. No matter what relationship you're in, even a great one, it's going to take work. A lot of people might get caught up in the misconception of, oh, relationships are all sunshine and roses. I'm going to jump into it and it's going to make my life infinitely better. People should go into a relationship knowing that it is something that requires a lot of work. The more work you're willing to put in it, the more fulfilling it will be. So only dive into a relationship if you are ready to make it a main priority in your life. If not, the quality of your relationship will lack, and it can also make your life worse as opposed to better. So know that it will require work in what you're getting into. And then additionally, you and your wife were doing something very smart where you were playing to your strengths. You knew that you were better off together by doing this writing and journaling together versus maybe having to, right off the top of your head, ramble on about something and not be able to be as succinct or concise with how you communicate. So each couple should know that each relationship is different, and you need to learn how your relationship is, what's contextual to your relationship, what you guys should do as opposed to others. We talked about how advice is contextual early on, and that applies to relationships too. Learn your situation, learn who you are as a couple, and then be able to play into that, play to your strengths, and try to work around your weaknesses.
I like that. And, it's not going to be perfect. It's comparatively speaking, I feel like this, my life now is practically perfect, but I'm comparing it to what it used to be. And like I said, it was rough. At the time it didn't seem as rough as it was, but I was definitely, intentionally blind to what was happening. So in hindsight, the way things are now, I don't feel like they could really get any better, not because I can't make them better, but because there's no more better to get. You know what I mean? Like I won't say it's perfect because we are both human and, we make mistakes, probably myself more than her. But again, coming back to some of that, self-deprecation, but it's our life. Our life is good. I wish I didn't have as many student loans as I do, but if that's my only problem right now, like I feel like it's great. I wake up every morning. I don't dread anything. I don't, I'm not wishing I had more. Well, no, I don't want to quite say that because sometimes there are times that I wish I had stuff, but like I'm not wanting for a better life, I guess is probably the best way to put that. Like there are always things that I would like to have, but I would love to have a boat. I go fishing. I would love to have a nice new bass boat, but I could survive without it. You know what I mean? It's not going to make my life substantially better. That's just a neat thing to have. I'm not wanting for a healthy relationship or to get out of, a monstrous pile of debt because my ex-wife, ran up all the credit cards and has no plans on paying them because, she didn't want to keep her job. So, we are doing well. And, being able to say that tied off the last bit of rope for, my mind starting a family. And, once I was still terrified. Like, there was no way to not be terrified. But once I could convince myself that all of the pieces are in place for supporting a family, I think it is a distinction. It's an important distinction to make because, several folks around me and friends who have kids and stuff like that, they're like, you can never be fully ready. And I'm like, no, but let me tell you, you can definitely prepare the space and resources around you. Like, there are a lot of things you can do to help get ready. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you can't, like, at least do some of that. That's just total horseshit. I think, to use a specific example, don't have kids if you can't afford them. Like, some folks use that as a derogatory statement, but I believe there is some merit to it, in that if you're bringing a kid into this world and you don't have the resources to raise it, that is unfair to that child, and those are the kinds of thoughts that I had. Like, I don't want there to ever be a scenario where I cannot provide, at least to the best of my ability. There is never a scenario where I cannot provide something for that child needs. Whatever I have to do to be able to check that box, I feel like needs to happen first. And so once that was done, and, we were in a comfortable place in our relationship, and I didn't feel like things were going to go sideways after we had a kid, then my, emotional terror that it's never solvable. That's the part they say you can never be fully ready. I just kind of took that as it came. And, I think as the months passed, when my wife was pregnant, it never really fully sunk in. Like, I knew she was, and I knew we were having a child, but, like, it didn't quite hit. You know what I mean? Like, they just happened to be facts. They were just these are statements that are true. Like, the emotional connection to those things didn't happen. I feel like I heard this from a lot of folks, that the emotional part did not kick in until immediately when that child was born and I saw it for the first time. And then it all kind of just came at me at once. Like, holy shit, I have a child, and there it is. You know what I mean? Like, it all just kind of came exactly the same time, and it was an overwhelming flurry of all happy emotions, right? Like, at no point was I like, oh my God, I don't know if I can take care of this. Like, none of that was ever just remotely in my mind, right? All I could think about was that this is my child now. I have one, and I am the happiest father in the world. Did some of that other stuff come later? You bet. Once that high wears off, let me tell you, it gets tough. But I would not, if it's amusing, because it's like, if I go back to, like, my former self, like myself from, I don't know, 10 years ago, and said, hey, I know you despise the idea of having children, but guess what? Guess what's going to happen in 2022? I mean, my past self probably wouldn't believe it at the time, but, like I said, when there were so many other things influencing that perspective, that once all of that is gone, it's just like, yeah, I guess it's not so bad after all. And now that she's here, it's definitely stressful having a kid, for sure, 100%. But it's not unmanageable. And I think having a partner that is good at familial management. I love these buzzwords, man. I hope somebody's writing them down. It really helps. Like she's a very good planner. She's a very good observer, and that helps a lot with the day to day. Being compatible people raises a compatible child, and almost in some way. Like I think our daughter could be just about any kind of baby, and we would have figured out a way to make it work. We are very glad that she is the way she is, but we would not have been repulsed if she was more, not fragile, but finicky or emotional or overexcited or, whatever variations of babies exist, right? We would have figured it out because we had the capability to do so.
And this brings up a good point, which is you're talking about having a partner who's very good with family life, things like that. A lot of people might not think about how when you're in a relationship with someone, you're living a life together where you're going to have to tackle challenges together. You're going to have to pay bills. You're going to have to raise kids. A lot of people think, oh, we're in love. This is great. Yes, it's an amazing feeling, and it can really help strengthen your relationship. But you do also live a life together where you're going to have shared goals like raising kids, things like that. And it's important to be able to recognize, is this a partner who I can work on goals together? Do we plan and strategize well together? Can we cover each other's weaknesses? Or is this someone who I love, but we can't effectively get things done together?
If you're going to become a professional podcaster, you got to learn to hold it.
Honestly, that was my biggest concern with starting a podcast. Was I use the bathroom a lot. I don't know how this is going to work out.
Yeah, for those that have no idea what we're talking about, we took a quick break, and I'm giving Jake crap for needing to take a break because I'm just like, all right, we could maybe that's more of a commentary about me. I have beverages here, sure too, but like, maybe I just drink less fluid. I don't know. I always learn, drink when you're thirsty, and I'm just not thirsty, I guess. I don't know. But yeah, no, you gotta learn to hold it sometimes.
No,
especially if you want to have, if you want to have a multi-hour podcast, like a lot of the podcasts I listen to are 2-3 hours long. And, that's just kind of the norm. You just kind of go at it all at once. Oh, well, that's all right. Jake's working on being a pro, I'm sure.
I am. It's okay, though. I got some diapers coming in the mail, so problem solved.
That I feel like we're going in the wrong direction.
Well, speaking of diapers, let's get back to kids. So,
you want me to tell you how many diapers I've bought?
Oh, Jesus.
So, okay.
Yeah, go for it.
So one of my things, being a dad who's also kind of a nerd, is that like I'm not trying to track every meticulous detail of our child's life, but like one thing I was trying to understand before she was born is that like, what is the diaper expense like? And there's no good answer for that. Like no one's just bothered to try and figure it out. And so the first thought I had was, all right, I'm going to record every diaper purchase that we make and how many those are. And, if I can't figure out the actual cost, at least I can figure out the quantity, right? So I have in front of me here, and I will include this in the show notes as well. I keep a small list of various dad notes so far. And, one of the sections are statistics on diapers purchased. Here we go. From newborn, we bought 265 newborn diapers, 450 size 1 diapers, 696 size 2 diapers. As you notice, they're starting to get larger per size. And thus far, 576 size 3 diapers. Now, those are diapers purchased, not diapers consumed, because we go to Costco and we buy the large quantities. But the one thing I've noticed in this trend is that as she grows, the time between diaper sizes gets longer, because first number of weeks and months, she grew a lot. And then she started slowing down. So I imagine there are many thousands of diapers after this, but if somebody wants to do that math, you can, understand that you will be buying a lot of diapers. And I think that kind of comes back to my, argument for the readiness of having a child. One of the things that came up whenever we would talk about it is ensuring that we can fit a child into our budget. Adding the extra cost of baby into our budget every month. What is that going to look like? And how do we make that work? Wasn't just going to do it, say YOLO and see what happens. So I'm sure somebody out there would find that helpful. Note that our daughter is 8.5 months and we have consumed, what is that, for a couple thousand? I don't know. Let's do this live. 265 and 450 and 696 and 576 thus far. 1,987. Look at that. That's just purchased so far. And she's 8.5 months. So do with that info what you will. But I thought that would be an interesting little tidbit to share.
And related to that, on the topic of babies and finances, one online personality I follow online, his online name is Mr. Money Mustache. And
I've heard of him, yeah.
Yeah, he's really big on finances. And he has a blog post about an argument for only having one kid relating to because of like financial reasons. And I know that you and I in our prep call talked a little bit about one kid versus two kids. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on having one kid versus two kid and maybe the factors that are playing around in your mind with if you should have a second kid or not.
So I heard a lot of argument for having two kids that was all centered around so they could entertain each other. Like, that's fine. But that didn't seem like a convincing enough argument by itself. Like, okay, sure. Like, pass off some of the entertainment of children to other children. Fine. When I grew up, I'm 33. I haven't grown up yet. My younger brother was almost 6 years younger than me. And we more or less grew up apart, so it's, while I wasn't an only child, we did not go to the same schools ever because we were too far apart for that. We did not have the same interests. We were not at the same stages in our life. Like, there was very little that we could relate to as siblings, like in the category of siblings, right? So like, even though my parents had two kids, well, it didn't really help in the they will entertain each other category. So like, there's, if that's the route you're going to take, you kind of have to put them close together, and that puts extra pressure both on you as a parent and your finances. Like, it's, we are on track to ensure that our daughter does not have to pay for college, which is great. We could not do that for a second child. We don't have enough. There's just not enough extra cash for that. See my earlier discussion on, ensuring that every opportunity is available for said child. I would feel terrible if I could not provide equally for this second child. And maybe that's all superficial and I'd find a way to do it, blah, blah, blah. If you, really want to do it bad enough, sure, fine. But even all of that aside, we are not necessarily young on the spectrum of the parental age, like becoming a parent age range, right? I'm 33, my wife is 35. We are tired millennials, right? We could have another kid, but we look at where we will be if that, opportunity arises, and we think about, can we both individually and together mentally handle a second child? Like, I think a lot of the conversation that I never really see from actual parents is, can we handle it ourselves? What kind of toll is that going to take on us? Not necessarily we need to have a second child because society says we need to have a second child, or some so-and-so says, or grandparents says we need to have more grandbabies. You know what I mean? Like, there needs to be more conversation about how it impacts you as the parent. Like, first and foremost, your needs should come first in that conversation. How your kid grows up is not going to be impacted by there being a sibling. It's going to be impacted by you as a parent. I know plenty of people that were only children that turned out entirely fine. I don't like the idea of using additional kids as an excuse in any way, or doing it because somebody says you have to, or because it's the norm, or any of that. It feels gross, and it feels like you're setting up this mythical second child, even the first one, or third child, or fourth child. You're setting them up for some kind of disadvantage if you're only doing it because you'd feel like you have to. You know what I mean? Like it might not reflect immediately, but we're all disgusting humans at our core. Like that's going to show up somewhere later in life. And some people really enjoy having large families, but the vibe I get from those is that that's intentional. Like they want that large family. They weren't told they need to have that large family, or they didn't have the second kid because of the first kid, or they didn't have the third kid and the fourth. You know what I mean? Like that was all a very intentional maneuver, or there was some other influence, be it religious, or they just, like whatever, there was some motivation for it that wasn't, from some outside stimuli. Does that make sense?
Yeah, making sure that you're consciously deciding to have a kid because you love having multiple kids, you're doing it for you, versus because of the thought of needing to do it for your child. A single child can still turn out very well. They don't necessarily need a sibling. And being able to challenge society's assumptions with that, and knowing when you're making your own decision versus when you're just doing what society's telling you to do.
Yeah. Yeah. To sum that up, in one sentence, I would say, do what you feel is best. We have enough kids. Like society has enough children. Like if you don't have kids, nothing bad is going to happen. I promise. Like, your parents who are itching for grandchildren might be disappointed, but if they're going to take issue with that, that is a separate problem. You should not be catering to that. Like if you decide kids are not for me, that's okay. That's absolutely okay. Anyone that tells you that it's not okay is not okay, and that should be dealt with. So yeah, definitely from a financial perspective, one kid is a lot easier to plan around. Especially, like we've been lucky so far in that our daughter doesn't need much, like generally speaking, the various baby supplies, that's all to be expected. Toys, diapers, food, blah, blah, blah. Right. She doesn't have any conditions. She doesn't have any special needs or any of that stuff that, ends up costing, unfortunately, a lot of money. Right. So we feel very lucky in that regard. But because of that, we see how much more complicated things can get. And we want to be able to prepare for that. Cause like, we don't know what life is going to look like for her or for us, in the future. But going back to that whole planning thing, I would like to at least have the resources for every possible outcome. I can't plan for it, but I would be able to better handle it if I didn't have to worry about, all of a sudden, she's 5 years old and needs like a kidney transplant or something like whack like that, like that would be incredibly unfortunate if she did. But if she did need that, we can handle it. We're set. We're ready to go, and I don't know how well we'd be able to do that if we had 2 children. And maybe some of that is, me internalizing some of it. I think we've come to the conclusion that, the resource planning and gathering concept is a pretty strong one for me. So perhaps I am skewing it a bit in that regard, but I definitely do not disagree that the financial burden of 2 children is substantial. And I think about, I don't want to get too depressing, but I think about families who exist and children born into this world who don't have anything, resources, whatever, however you wanted to measure that. Right. And I feel bad because like, I didn't grow up in a family that had money. We were I didn't realize until I'm an adult how poor we actually were. My parents did a good job of hiding it. Like, I think about that and it terrifies me and it makes me sad. And just knowing that, like, at practically any day, I could lose my home. Thinking, like, as a kid, I could lose the place that I sleep. And like that, putting that kind of potential on a child, especially one that doesn't understand any of that, like that just, I don't even know how to describe like those kinds of feelings, like that should never be, I promise we'll come out of this dark hole here in a second, but like those kinds of things should never get anywhere close to that. And like, coming back to what I said, like if you can't financially afford children, like it's okay to not have them. You know what I mean?
No, and it's a good point where a lot of people might just have a kid because they think this is the next step in the progression society tells me. They say I should get married. They say I should have a kid. Consciously think before having a kid. Are you doing it because you want to? And not only that, do you have the means to take care of this kid and provide it the life that would do it well? Are you going to be able to give it all the opportunities it needs and take care of it? Or are you doing this and then the child is the one who's going to have to suffer because you're just kind of hopping into it prematurely without having the resources?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And, the reference you're making to Mr. Money Mustache and the single kid, I found that article and I'll put that in the list of links here. But,
Nice.
One of the things that he focused on in that article is what I mentioned about kids your own age. Like it's even just a couple years apart, like friends that I had growing up, elementary and middle school and stuff like that, especially, who had siblings that were even a year, 2 years apart. Like at that age, those small age gaps are huge. Like, so sure, they may only be 2 years apart, but they might as well be a decade apart at that age, at those age ranges. You know what I mean? Like they might as well just not even exist to each other outside of the home. And that, I think, kind of takes away a lot of the argument for they can entertain each other. It's like, well, maybe at home, sure, and on the weekends, but at school, they are foreign to each other. They are entirely different countries to each other. Like that's, I don't think people think about that a lot. And, especially with how gnarly this social circles are at those ages, like, oof, I would not want to be a kid in middle school again. Let's put it that way.
No, definitely not. And on the topic of factors that people don't think about with having kids, we talked about having kids at the age you are now, what age you would have kids if you were to have a second one, and how you'd be older, and factoring that in. I think that there are pros and cons to having kids young, having kids old. I know that some people argue, oh, I want to have kids young because then I'll be younger and can play with them as they get older. Other people want to have kids older because then they can spend more time with their spouse and have a life together before they have kids. I'm wondering your thoughts on the pros and cons to having kids younger versus older, and what you might prefer to lean towards, and if that's something you can even fully plan for.
I think you can biologically plan for it through various means, i.e. birth control, right?
Yep.
Mentally, I believe it's going to vary greatly from individual to individual. I don't believe that there's mentally the best time to have kids. See earlier, my earlier perspective. Physically, I know a lot of dads who are approaching 40 who are in way better shape than I am, and I know a lot of dads who are not, that's, I think a lot of it is it's going to be up to the individual. I think a lot more than it seems. Like some folks can, I know some folks who had kids at their, early mid-20s and they're doing just fine. At least on the outset. It's entirely possible that they're struggling and losing their minds on the inside, but that's not what they show. So throw that asterisk out there too, of course. if you have a friend that has 4 or 5 kids, like they may appear to be doing just fine, but are they really? Like, would you ever actually know if they weren't, And if you would, great. You can use them as an actual example of maybe it's not so bad. But ultimately, what somebody else does should never dictate what you do, right? Like if I was 23 and all of my other friends were getting married and having kids immediately and all that stuff, like good for them, I guess. Like I'm not going to jump onto that bandwagon, and nobody should feel pressured to do so. On the flip side, as you get older, recognize that as you get older, your body is going to change, for lack of better words.
The
right?
puberty talk.
It is puberty plus, right? It's what comes after that. We had a good run, but now we're 45 and things are starting to not be great. And, I'm keeping it vague because it varies differently from person to person, but I think everybody understands what I'm getting at, right? And so that's something that you have to take into account too. We as a society are a lot better at what we call geriatric pregnancies, which sounds like 65-year-olds giving birth, but it's really not. It's anyone over the age of 35, I believe. If a woman is over the age of 35, it's considered a geriatric pregnancy. Fun fact. We learned that because my wife was approaching 35 when our daughter was born. So like that was a topic that almost had to come up. Mm-hmm. There are entirely different sets of processes for how the hospital and the doctors treat a pregnancy when you magically turn 35. It's so silly. But there's a reason for that. Like there's, there have been enough issues over time where it's like, okay, now we have to treat these differently and, with more care, quite literally with more care. And, I think about that, like if we had another child, what would that look like as far as the pressure and medical burden on my wife to have a second child? Like if I really, really wanted to have one and she didn't, like, am I really going to be that selfish and insist on one, knowing the potential? Like maybe it's entirely fine. It could very well be entirely fine. My mom had my younger brother when she was 37. Turned out fine. But I think even through all of that, where it could be fine at 40, you could be one of those lucky folks that is able to have kids at 45. Great, cool, awesome. But the only way that should be happening is if that was a decision you made specifically and you are entirely fine with the potential complexities that come with that. Like nobody should be pressuring you to have kids older. Obviously there are like socioeconomical factors to that too. Us millennials, especially, I don't know how far into the millennial range you might be, but it's a known fact, like statistically, we are having kids older for a number of reasons, and a lot of it is, finance related, or folks want to spend more time on growing themselves. Like the idea that you get married and start a family and become a homemaker is a lot more dried out than it used to be, and that's not where a lot of folks are putting their heads anymore. That's all fine too, regardless of what society says, what your friends say or doing, whatever. Like it's your choice. If you want to have a kid at 20, I mean, I sure as shit hope you're ready, but 20 might not be a good example. I'll say 25. 25 might be a little bit better. Please don't have kids at 20. I'm just gonna say that. Don't. I didn't know a single individual at 20 that was like mentally sane enough for that. 25, if that's when you want to start a family, if you got all your ducks in a row, as I've been harking on for the last 45 minutes, great, go for it. If you want to wait until you're 35, also great, go for it. If you want to wait until never, also great, go for it. But let it be your decision and not anybody else's. That's my opinion on that.
I love that, man. I think that's a good wrap on the kids stuff for now. I feel like you're a natural when it comes to wording some of these things. I think it comes from the podcasting experience And that's the next
I
thing.
had a lot of time to think about it too, which really helped me hone in on, like if somebody, if this ever comes up in real life, all of the times that I have conversations about it, I'll be ready, right? Like I spent a lot of time thinking about this, if you couldn't tell already.
No, these are important questions to think about, where it really helps to let the information settle, and then you can form more of a critical opinion versus just acting very rashly. It's interesting on that. A lot of people will overemphasize small decisions that don't really matter, and they don't put enough time and energy into the bigger decisions. With life, most of us are going to be fine, and there are just a few very big decisions that are going to have a crazy amount of impact. Things like who you're going to marry, or having kids, or maybe where you live in the world, and like opening mortgages. These kind of things have massive impact, versus over analyzing, oh, should I buy this new jacket or not? So people should really emphasize the big decisions and not waste as much time and energy on the small ones.
Yeah, it did definitely help when comparing those two categories together. Like later in life, when I had the disposable income where I could just stop thinking about, should I buy X? Whatever, sure, fine. That I think kind of helped make that easier to keep those two things distinct and separate from each other. We spent a lot of time, like you said, mortgage. Like we spent a lot of time looking for mortgage lenders, right? Because that's a huge thing, right? We spent a lot of time figuring out when we were going to time, for us, figuring out when we were going to time the housing market collapse that never came. Until now, it's a little late for that, but we spent a lot of time planning that out, and because of that, we have a 2.5% interest mortgage. You know what I mean? Like we nailed that because we planned and got it at the right time. And I don't necessarily care if the next car that I lease has the absolute best interest rate, or money factor, or like the best monthly payment, or whatever. Like stuff like that doesn't necessarily matter as much, because I've gotten to the point where I can just absorb all of that. But it took a hell of a lot of effort to get there, a hell of a lot of time, and it helps that I have a well-paying career too.
100%. And the next topic I want to hop into is podcasting. I know that you have a good amount of podcasting experience. You've done podcasts with our buddy Dylan, who we're going to try to get him to hop back in and start podcasting with you again. I talked to him.
I keep bringing it up, but this guy, I don't know. They're working on some pretty cool things over there, so I can't really harass him too much. Like I know he's a busy guy. Like trying to get him scheduled for the shows and stuff was already difficult. That's when he really wanted to do it. So.
Oh yeah. Well, I say don't. Yeah, but I say don't give up. I think if you hound him enough, he'll do it. But I wanted to get your advice on podcasting. Any general tips you have? I know that we talked about show notes. We talked about having chapters in your podcasts. Any lessons learned? I'm trying to just learn as much as I can. So I'd love to hear your perspective and experience.
So the thing about the podcast that we did that I appreciated the most was actually making the podcast, more than like the content and like getting it out there and stuff like that. But that's probably more unique to me than I think the average individual. I know a lot of folks do podcasts as a form of marketing, getting their name out there, bringing in traffic for whatever thing it is, right? Like you had a motivation for starting the show that wasn't just necessarily, I want to make a podcast for funsies. You know what I mean? Like you had a purpose, right? I jumped onto the podcast train as a solution to Dylan's problem, that, producing the show, right? I was more the producer than anything else. And that was entirely fine. Like that was the role I was most comfortable in. And, if anything, I could help steer Dylan in directions. But if you've heard any of the episodes, that guy will talk and talk. Dylan, I love you, dude, but oh my God, it also made it easy to edit, right? Because he's very good at, conveying his thoughts with words. So I didn't, in the first few episodes, I spent a lot of time editing. And I realized I didn't actually really have to. Like I feel like there are two different classes of podcasts. There are the topical, kind of off the cuff type stuff, like what you and I are doing. And then there's like the highly produced show that like you would hear, like Serial, for example, is like probably the biggest name that everyone's familiar with, right? Or This American Life. Like it's more of like a radio program of yore than it is a podcast, right? It is more of a show. It's more of a show than a podcast. Now that doesn't make any sense, but like it's, it's a packaged, produced production than it is a podcast. And, I always wanted to steer away from that because I don't like those types of podcasts. I think the most heavily produced show I ever listened to was the podcast kind of true crime-esque mini series about the what was it? The cult NXIVM. Do you remember? Did you ever hear about that?
No. What is NXIVM?
NXIVM was. I don't want to spoil it too much. But
I could.
The end of that story is that the leader is in jail or something of that sort. It involved a lot of like that weird self-helpy, voodoo-y, guru-y bullshit that you often hear terrible stories about. But he would lure women in, and yeah, it was basically a cult. I'll just put it that way. I'll put a link in the show notes. It was a good show, and I listened to the first season, and I think there was a second season. I don't know. I listened to just about everything that there was there for that show, and it was a lot, but it was really good. Granted, it's the only one I've ever listened to, but I think I was gravitated towards it because it wasn't super heavily produced. I steer away from like the NPR type stuff or like, like I said, This American Life type stuff. Like I tried to get into some of those, and it just felt like I was listening to extensions of the radio programs, and that's not really, I rarely listen to the radio. So yeah, as far as tips go, I'm surprised I remembered that.
One question on that. So
Yeah.
on the topic of podcast editing, so what kind of editing do you do? Do you still do, or did you do? Did you do light editing? Did you not really edit anything out? I have two questions on editing, and then we could jump into general podcasting stuff.
Some real-time follow-up. The show was called Escaping NXIVM, and it was a podcast done by the CBC, which fantastic. I'll put a link in the show notes. Anyways, editing. So the first handful of episodes, I think I was about to touch on this and then I got sidetracked, but the first handful of episodes, I did a lot of editing, a lot of splicing together words and removing ums and uhs and all this other stuff. And I spent, for an hour show, I probably spent another 2 or 3 hours on it. That didn't feel sustainable for what we were trying to produce. I was putting in high quality production type effort into a casual show, and it didn't feel right. Like it didn't feel like it was adding any value to the content. So after a handful of episodes, I more or less just stopped doing most of that. Like I would do maybe a handful of things. I would level out the sound so it all not just was like at the same volume, but the same loudness, right? So like if I shouted at you, you could tell I'm shouting, but it's not like going to blow your ears out. Do you know what I mean? Like there's the distinction there. Also, if I ended up whispering, could bring some of that up. So you can still tell I'm whispering and it doesn't sound funny, but you're also not like having to turn the volume up to, account for the whispers and stuff like that. Right. So that was a big thing that I did just kind of across the whole program. And then I would go through and look for any long pauses. So, one thing I picked up in Dylan's speech, kind of like presentation speech, he would say a thing and then he would say another thought. Like there would be like his transitionary period would have pauses, long pauses, but like they weren't incoherent thoughts either. So like I could, scroll through the timeline and see those, shorten him up a little bit. So it sounded like it was more natural speech. And that was probably the most editing I did after the first few episodes, was just cleaning up stuff like that. And then as we would transition between individuals that were talking, kind of cut out any kind of overlap, or if, restated a question, right, you obviously cut out the first attempt at it. But we didn't really focus too heavily on making sure everything was all neat and tidy and packaged and perfect. Like, that was never it. Like I said, because it didn't feel like it provided a lot of extra value. It wasn't something we did, So like, thinking about you and I, how we're talking, some of my longer pauses, I would probably cut those, trim those up a bit, but I wouldn't like, I think one thing I had mentioned in our prep call was that, like, the show is the show, right? Did I say that out loud, or was I just thinking it? Like, that's the thing I think, but I don't know if I actually said that.
I would love to hear you elaborate on that point.
So like, yeah. So like, in my head, like, the show is the show, right? Like, I think, and maybe this is me projecting what I appreciate in podcasts onto other people and their shows. But like, I feel like it is the most genuine and the most interesting when it is the most just normal and like real. I don't want to say raw, because, obviously there's still going to be some editing that goes into it, but like, the format of the show that represents what actually happened and represents the actual natural conversation that took place between the individuals, I feel like is the most appropriate for that medium. Again, with the asterisk that I bias towards, topical off the cuff type programming, not heavily produced stuff. Obviously, your mileage may vary. You might be interested in totally the other way around. It's fine. Like I said, I listen to 3-hour podcasts on the regular, and I don't get bored, because I feel like I'm just listening to a few people that I find interesting just talk about stuff. Make sense?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
The show is the show. So, yeah, like, it's, I didn't, when we started this program, now nearly 2 hours and 24 minutes ago, at least by my clock anyways, we kind of we didn't really like ramp up anything. There wasn't like hey, Johnathan, why don't you tell the world about yourself or something like that. We just kind of just jumped into it, like, the show is the show. Like, this is the program, we're not sitting down for an interview with some fancy exec and have to, tweak everything and have it just right and, say exactly the correct words. Like, I would never, it's obvious that there are times when, I have better words that I say to convey what I'm thinking. And I, more or less, as a guest, just kind of just trust you to figure that out. Like, that's kind of your job, not mine. Right. So I'm just going to say what I'm going to say. I'm not going to say, hey, can I do that over? I'm just going to do it over, and you make the show, because the show is the show. And obviously, I know that sounds super vague and it doesn't like actually explain it, but I think it also does. The show is the show. Like, it's two people hanging out talking about something that's interesting, rather than yet another radio program in downloadable form.
No, I'm with you, man. All about authenticity, enthusiasm, things like that. I'd say let's hop back to the general advice. I'd love to hear any general advice you have on podcasting.
We'll go ahead and close that parentheses now. Come back to the main topic. Yeah. Yeah. So, advice. I didn't think about that specifically too much. I feel like why somebody wants to start a podcast is so incredibly varied. Like, let me ask you a question. Maybe this will help steer my thought here a little bit. Why did you want to start this podcast?
Yeah. So, and feel free to ask any questions you want. I
realize I haven't asked you a single question this entire show.
Enough about me. Let's talk about you.
Yeah, right.
So I started this podcast just as a way to have amazing, fun, engaging conversations with people. I love being able to learn about people, learn about how they think, why they do what they do, just because, one, I'm just genuinely curious and interested in other people. I love people in general. And also, it's a great way to teach me new things. And these type of conversations just off the cuff also are one of the most fulfilling things for me, make me feel the most alive. So less about monetization, marketing, and more just about how many fun, interesting conversations can I have with people.
So I will re-ask that question again in a slightly different way, and I think you'll understand why. Why start this podcast in comparison to something like just starting a blog or, doing just exclusively a YouTube channel or something where you have video interviews? Like why the podcast format specifically?
So that's a good question. I like that you dug deeper. I will include video, but to highlight the main point, I was initially thinking just podcasting, and that was because I wanted to be able to focus more on just having fun, engaging conversations with people and less about doing over the top editing. Like a lot of people would tell me, oh, Jake, if you want to make this thing big, you have to put a lot of content on TikTok, Instagram, you have to do this. But for me, it's more about the conversations, enjoying them, and just focusing my time and efforts on that versus focusing on over the top production and trying to make things appealing in that way.
And so that's the question. See, I'm getting somewhere with that. That's the kind of question I would ask if somebody said I wanted to start a podcast. Like what about a podcast specifically is interesting to you? Because it is a media where it's super easy to start with all, the plethora of tools out there, right? We're using Riverside, but there's probably a half dozen or more others that do similar things that help you create, podcast content without having to have, editing suite or, understanding how to edit audio in Logic or stuff like that, right? Like those tools have made it incredibly easy to start a show. But the one thing I always come back to is, why do you want to start the show specifically? Like that should be something you should be able to answer, because if you can't, that will come through in the presentation of the content. You have to like the idea of that style of content and be able to convey your message in that style of content. So as somebody who is not great at using their words to explain things, I've still gotten good at being able to tie off my rambles. You know what I mean? Like that's good enough. And I know that that's my weakness, and I've been able to work around that. And I can solve that in editing if I have to. But I have to be aware that that was even an issue to begin with, and know how to handle that and what that actually looks like and how do I keep myself on track. Like I said, I've got the book, right? I've got the outline that helps me keep on track. Like you got to think about all of this stuff when you're doing it in podcast mode. Otherwise, you're just randomly talking, and the people who are listening are going to lose the thread very quickly. And then they're going to switch it off. So go ahead.
Oh, no, I was going to say, I think that that's a good point where working backwards from why you're starting the podcast, what are you trying to do? And then making sure that your message ties up with that, as well as that you're choosing the right medium for the kind of content you want to present, that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Cause there are a lot of folks that excel video, right? YouTube channels coming out of ears, right? And there are many of them that are stellar, exquisite stuff. But like what they're sharing with you might not actually work well in podcast form, in audio only form, or audio plus casual video, right? I personally believe podcasts are audio only, but that is, I respect that some folks like to include video as well, which is okay. I will not tear into you for that one. I'll let you have that one. But I think that also comes from the fact that like I got started listening to podcasts like in the mid 2000s, when podcasts were quite literally just, people talking that you downloaded to your iPod, quite literally. Like that's where the whole concept of a podcast started, was the iPod, right? So my perspective on podcasts are a little bit more traditional, but I think at the same time, I'm probably not in the minority. I recognize that, there's an entire audience out there that likes the audio visual medium and having it in multiple formats is helpful, right? Some folks that have podcasts that also show up on their YouTube channels. Shout out to my Amazon guy, Steve, Stephen Pope. Great dude. He was on an episode of Welcome to Growth, and I believe I was on one of his shows at one point too. Boy, 2020 was really a blur. He does the multiple format, but he also does not spend a ton of time on post-production and editing, right? Like it's the format is totally fine. But the meat and the substance is in the audio, is in the spoken word. And to bring all of that back around, understanding why podcast and what benefit could be had from the podcast medium specifically, I think is step 0 and step 0.5 to making the podcast happen. Once you've got that figured out, the actual content, style of show, if you want to have guests or just have hosts on every week and it's just all topical news related stuff, you can figure all of that out later. That all of that stuff will just fall in line based on your desires and needs. In the early episodes of Welcome to Growth, I spent the effort on like intro music and all that stuff. You'll hear it in probably the first 4-ish episodes. And then from there on out, I cut that out and then just did a quick music hit and had no intro whatsoever. Like we just went right into it. Like I said, the show is the show, right? We just went straight into it. The moment Dylan showed up, it's the moment I hit record, and that was it. We're off to the races at that point. And I feel like it helped create a more natural program. There wasn't when we had guests, there's obviously some level of structure and, like we don't know you don't know us type of thing, like having different individuals on every week, you kind of have to figure out ways to kind of poke them into opening up. You know what I mean? Like some folks are better at just kind of going off the cuff and ad-libbing than others. Those who are not as good were generally there mostly to promote whatever thing they had. That's fine. To each their own. I won't say any style of content is better than the other, but do whichever style feels most comfortable to you, or it's going to feel forced, whatever style that is. So to me, it appears you like the more kind of interview style. You like to, you're here in this program to learn from the person that you're talking to. Right. You're kind of just letting me just say my words, and there isn't a lot of like interview questions, like tell me a time when you had to struggle with this you know what I mean? Like just like the canned stuff. Right. I think that's great. That's, I didn't really have anything to say besides just that observation. Does that all make sense? I kind of just let that one die off there in the end.
That was great. I have 2 specific questions, and then I want to hop to the wrap-up questions as well. There's a lot more I want to cover, but we'll have to save that stuff for round 2, talking more about candle business, you moving a lot, things like that. The last podcasting questions I want to ask is, you mentioned in our prep call chapters as well as show notes. I wanted to see if you could give any advice on like how to write good show notes, including chapters, things to help with podcasts like this where we're doing long form and jump around. So that way it's easier for people to kind of hop to where they want to go.
Yeah, I like the idea of show notes because it helps people follow along with what you're talking about. So, we've brought up a handful of things today, or I've brought up a lot of, a handful of things today, just from left. Like if you looked at the entire list, you were like, wow, they covered a lot of stuff. Right. But imagine you're listening to this program that's now, 2.5 hours and you're like, they talked about that one thing, they talked about the love languages back at, 1 hour and 20 minutes or whatever that was. Like, where was that? Right. The show notes help aggregate all of the stuff that was discussed that might be of interest to people listening that want to kind of learn more and kind of follow up with that on their own time. The chapter markers help you jump back to that or jump forward over something you're not interested in if you want to go back and listen to it, right? So program like this that is 2.5 hours long, chapters, I certainly hope you can add chapters to this show. Just because we spent a lot of time talking about a lot of things, and being able to break up this long audio file into chunks and letting folks potentially jump around or go back to something. Maybe they want to go straight to the conversation that we had about kids because that's most important to them. They don't have to try and figure out where in the episode that is. They can just go straight to it. Make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. I'm definitely going to add those to these podcasts as well as future ones. And related to us jumping around to a lot of stuff and hitting about like the 2.5 hour mark, wanted to hop into some of the wrap up questions for now. The first one that comes to mind is what does success mean to you and why? I think that a lot of us have different definitions of success. For someone, it might be traveling the world, going to a lot of countries. Someone, it might be doing something related to charity. And I think it helps to learn about different people's versions of what success is for them.
You know, my first reaction to that question is, you know, the way you've defined success through your examples, which, you know, I will preface this with, there is no wrong answer to this question and there is no wrong way to define success. But the way I look at how success was defined in this context makes it sound to me like there is some finish line. Mm-hmm. And I don't believe that such a thing exists. You know, I think success, you will have many successes in your life. I think success will come many times. And so I don't believe that like there is one uber success, right? Like, you know, so for some folks, they could say, all right, I've been able to travel the world, you know, and that is success for me. I would argue that is a success. You've checked off your bucket list. That is a success. But there are still other components of your life that are still in flight. Once those have matured, those are also individual successes. So what does success look like to me? I think it heavily depends. I'm going to give you a non-answer and I'm going to try to answer it. It depends on which part of my life you're talking about. You know, like if we're talking about my family, I feel like having a family, having a cohesive family, that is success for me in the family category. You know, as far as finances go, not having to worry about debt, that is a success. Being able to build wealth for our future, that is success, right? Like success for me is highly, highly dependent on the topic. You know, I cannot say like what like an overall success looks like, because I feel like, all right, I've checked the financial success box. I've checked the familial success box. But then there's going to be another thing, and then there's going to be another thing, and then there's going to be another thing. I think if I had to try and define it, success, an overall overarching success, is not having any major regrets when I die. You know, to be a little morbid, right? Just because there are so many stages of my life, I can't just put a finish line on it, because then there's going to be something afterwards that, you know, I'm going to want to try and succeed at in some fashion. And then we just start the whole thing all over again.
I'm with you, man. I view life in a very similar way. And you, from our conversations, seem like a very happy person. And I think a lot of it is because of the way you view success, where viewing success in life as more of a process, where goals are maybe a North Star that you work towards, as opposed to something you hit and you're finally happy. So being able to just continuously grow in the areas that are important to you without tying your happiness to achieving certain results, as well as you mentioned how you'll hit one goal and then another one pops up. life's going to continuously hand you new things you want to achieve. That's part of being human, and making sure not to feel the need to achieve those before you let yourself be content with what you have, because there will always be a next thing. And that's a recipe for unhappiness.
Agree 100%. Though at the same time, I would also argue that, what is there's a turn of phrase regarding the devil's hands or idle or something like that, or I don't
Oh, yeah.
you know what I'm thinking of. I'll probably
yeah.
remember after we're done. But, like taking that into kind of the context of what we're talking about here, like complacency is also, I don't know, it's a risky maneuver to be complacent, because it's a very short walk to regret. You might not get there, like you might not actually regret the complacency. Some people don't. Some people are entirely fine with, quote, living an average life. Like there's no reason that literally everybody everywhere should be above average. Like it sounds great. Everybody should strive to be their best self, but sometimes their best self is just average, like I feel like that's okay too. Not everyone's going to be a small business owner, stuff like that. So I just wanted to throw that little, caveat or yet another asterisk, or, some kind of alternate perspective on that. I think, it's easy for folks to feel like I haven't, I don't know what my successes are, therefore I haven't succeeded. Well, maybe you have, but you're looking too large, or you're thinking about it in the wrong context. Like, I have a degree, but I have, I'm not an expert in my field. It's like, well, getting the degree is a success. Being able to move through the collegiate system sometimes is a rather large success. It's not always easy for some folks, and the rest of it's going to take time. As you progress through that, you will succeed as an entry-level individual, and then you'll move up the ranks and you will succeed at that. And then you'll succeed at the next thing and the next thing. Like those are all successes. And I feel like they should be looked at both collectively and individually, because if you're not looking at those individually on their own, it's easy to lose track of all of the actual accomplishments you've had in life.
Yeah, it's important to keep progressing, keep growing, not getting too comfortable and resisting growth and fulfillment. And then also not undermining your own successes, where success is a continuous process. You can get to those major achievements, but you have to hit the smaller ones along the way. So recognize the wins and keep going. I think that's a great point to wrap up on. And what I'd like to say is there anything else you'd like to leave the audience with, either random thoughts or advice? And then also anything or any place where people can find you, if you want to shout out your Twitter, your blog, or remain anonymous. So completely up to you.
I mean, no one's anonymous on the internet. Let's put it that way. It's fine. I think through all the things that we've discussed today, like a lot of it centered around the internal mental struggle / conflict that, I experienced with all of these things. Right. And I feel like by taking the understanding that I have these mental weaknesses in all of these projects and aspects of life, taking that seriously and knowing what that looks like, how it impacts my day to day and, new projects I take on, my family, my job, etc. Just being aware was incredibly helpful in all of those aspects. Like not even trying to fix it, just knowing where my weaknesses are and knowing, like, going back to the coffee sample pack project, right? And knowing, where my head was at, and recognizing that I took the easy path with something else, and knowing that I'm capable of that, and knowing that that's going to happen, and recognizing I'm going to have to tie this off afterwards. You know what I mean? Like seeing that play out time and again has made me super familiar with it. And I don't have a good solution for fixing it, but knowing that it's there, I think has been incredibly helpful everywhere in life. And I don't know, I'm not super good with just the generic life advice. Just understand if I was to try and tie that up a little bit more succinctly here, let me take a swing at this. Knowing your weaknesses is more valuable than fixing them, I would say, in one sentence.
That's awesome, man. Hey, that's a great wrap up there. Any place you'd like to? Oh, wait, jump in. So you got something?
No. Any place you'd like to come find me on the internet? Yeah, I mean, again, I'll share all the links with you here, but you can find me on Twitter where I shitpost mostly. You won't find a lot of tweets of value there on Twitter @_JOHLYM. You can find me on my personal blog that I rarely update, but sometimes do, Johnathan.org, spelled with 2 H's. You can also find me at sellerjournal.com, where I mentioned the retail arbitrage brand database exists there. That blog is more catered towards e-commerce / business type topics, if you're curious. You can also find me at seaplanecoffee.com, as we mentioned, the coffee business. If you want to go buy some coffee from me, great. Under no obligation to do so, but I would not say no. And if you wanted to buy some candles, we didn't really touch on that. Maybe we'll touch on it another day. Cascade Handcrafts.com. That'll take you to my Etsy shop if you want to get something that smells really neat. I think that's all of my places. You don't really want to hang out with me on Facebook. I don't spend time there. LinkedIn, I don't see any value in LinkedIn professionally. Nothing we've talked about here ever makes it to LinkedIn. I don't really care about LinkedIn. Sorry, guys. I'm not gonna plug that. I mean, you can find me there. I don't care. Like my whole career history is practically there, but whatever. Fine. That's that.
Awesome. Thanks, man. This was a lot of fun. I'm looking forward to getting this one up. And
you're gonna be working on this one for a bit.
Oh yeah, it'll be good practice.
Is this your longest show?
This is the longest. Oh yeah. No, it's good. It's good. Hey, show notes are gonna come in handy. All right. Thanks for tuning in, everybody. I hope you enjoyed this episode and got some value from it. If you want to hear more content on decision making, thriving in uncertainty, eliminating ambiguity, and regret minimization, as well as other similar topics, feel free to check out my YouTube channel and my website, letsgetreckless.com. And definitely reach out and let me know what you thought about this episode. Improving the show is a continuous process, and your feedback helps me make this better over time and focus more on the content that's most helpful for you. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next episode.